No swearing.
We're kind of we're flexible on the language and lingo,
Are you?
and you know, just a little, as long as you give a little ahead of time. No, that's fine. Whatever works to get your points across, you do it, my friend.
Yeah, no worries. Well, thanks very much for inviting me to come and talk. And thank you for logging in. Yeah, and I mean, at the moment, I'm obviously doing a shameless advertisement for Le Pub Scientifique. So, welcome to my virtual pub. It's about time that we had a pint actually here, I think. So, but what I was going to do is just, yeah, I'll start you off. I'll share my screen here, and I'm going to show you. Yeah, I'll start you off in my sort of personal story, I suppose. So I was always fascinated with pain from a personal perspective. I think, you know, that was a big reason for me going into PT school. I was teaching with Noi at the time. So teaching with Noi, and we went to a meeting in Germany, and we were sitting around and we were chatting about some of the research out there, and I sort of see this as me being in the right place at the wrong time, where David Butler, who many of you will have heard of, basically threw out this question. He was like, has anybody read Loz's work on gradient motor imagery? If you don't know, Loz is Lorimer Moseley. And so there I am. I stick my hand up in the air, and he's brilliant. Right, okay. Who's going to help Beamsy write a course on graded motor imagery? And this was about 2008, 2009, something like that. So I unwittingly selected myself to to help write a new course about graded motor imagery. So there we go. That's my sort of start, and I sort of, from that moment on, really, I had to do an enormous amount of learning, reading, exploration of my own. So one thing is chatting, and it's brilliant to be able to chat with someone like Lorimer, who obviously came up with the concept and the approach graded motor imagery. But then the next thing you've got to do is you've got to have enough practice. So exploring it with people that I was seeing. So I was working at the time, where would I have been working? Probably in the north of England, I think. And I was running a pain management program. So it was difficult to see lots of patients at that time and take them through the process. And what I ended up doing was I started my own private practice, and I would see a lot of these people remotely, because it's fairly uncommon, the condition complex regional pain syndrome, which is the dominant condition that people the research was designed for. So effectively, I had to go and find a bunch of people where I could suddenly explore this idea of graded motor imagery on. So I did, yeah, it was a massive amount of learning at that time, and a huge amount of failing as well. So I would say, as a personal journey, I was in the right place at the wrong time. I was studying a master's on pain, and I was studying with Mick Thacker at the time. So I'd probably read pretty much everything Lorimer had ever written, and was just fortunate to be in a position through Noi where I could discuss with him about not just graded motor imagery, but, you know, the idea of being in the clinic and what was happening with our patients, and, you know, the results that we were getting when we were doing various different tests. But alongside Dave, I was able to explore writing as well. So Graded Motor Imagery Handbook, I suppose, was published 2 or 3 years after the I was voted in to help write Graded Motor Imagery, the course. I've called it a foundation, graded motor imagery as a foundation for creativity in the clinic. And I've just put a little paper clipping here. This is someone I still see. Her name's Jane. And so I had a little chat with Jane actually last week and just said, are you happy for me to just talk a little bit about you? But just to give, if no one's seen complex regional pain syndrome, then I think this is a sort of brilliant sensationalist title, isn't it? Accident sparks freak condition. Bump from a drunk caused me pain from puff of wind. And then if you can see that just underneath it, it says, but a miracle mirror therapy tricks mind to provide welcome relief. Let's just forget the sensationalist piece here. I think the important thing is, with a condition like complex regional pain syndrome, often a fairly innocuous injury can cause really significant, really pronounced pain. So it's one of the important diagnostic criteria for someone to meet this diagnosis of CRPS is pain that is out of all proportion to the inciting event. So here we have Jane with her dog in her wheelchair. I've got to say, this is actually a really positive view, because when I met her, she was in a dark room. She'd been in a dark room for 2 or 3 years at that stage, in bed, and she was transferred via ambulance weekly to go and have ketamine infusions, and then she would be transported back, so she'd have these overnight stays in hospital, ketamine infusions. And effectively what she'd done is she'd managed to fashion her room so she barricaded her affected side, her most affected side, which was her left side, against the wall, so no one could come near her left side. So yeah, I would say, you know, from someone's got a bit of feedback from you know, from this sort of initial presentation. Graded motor imagery, what it does is it offers hope for even the most disabling condition and presentation. So we'll come back to Jane as we go along, but I just thought I'd show you bump from a drunk caused me pain from puff of wind, and this idea of pain just from a puff of a wind, you know, the word for that is allodynia, isn't it? Is a sensory stimulus that ordinarily wouldn't cause pain that now is painful. So in someone with CRPS, they exhibit a number of different responses where there's a heightened response to different stimuli. It's not just wind, it's things like temperature changes. Someone I have at the moment, what's fascinating, I find fascinating, is noise, and how sound and noise and the different frequency of noise has an influence on the pain that she experiences in her legs. So yeah, this is one manifestation of CRPS. So there you go, that's my sort of potted history of getting involved in writing the handbook. I'd say one other thing whilst I'm on this slide. I mean, I'm just so thankful for having been given the opportunity to write. And if you haven't heard of them and you've not explored some of their work, one of the people who undoubtedly has had the greatest influence on my career is Dave Butler. Incredibly generous person, but also a prescient mind as well. He's someone who's very forward thinking as well, and had a massive influence on physical therapy in general. And Lorimer Moseley, he's just such a legend, but equally a massively generous person, and I would say one of the kindest individuals as well. So if you ever get a chance to chat to Lorimer, if you're at a conference ever again in the future, he's so generous with his time. And both of them were really, really generous with me. I basically invited myself to stay with them 10 years ago, and Lorimer took me into his lab and basically just treated me as just another member of their lab, which was just an amazing experience. And the same thing with David. I just was part of his team, part of his family. So I feel very, very honoured that I was welcomed in there. So there you go. How's this going to work? Are you going to go? There we go. So I guess we should say, what is graded motor imagery? So what is it and where did it come from? If you talk to Lorimer, he was working in the Australian Institute of Sport. So he was coming across athletes where they have pain just thinking about doing their task, their activity, their sport. So it doesn't give you many options coming from a sort of strict rehab background. You know, where do you go? Where do you go to help someone when just thinking of doing their movement is painful? And he was exploring the idea of pain, having read a really amazing book written by a guy called Ramachandran, Villanaya Ramachandran, Phantoms in the Brain. And I just, one of the coolest bits of research that I read with that Ramachandran sort of influenced this work is he was exploring touch in the amputated limb of someone with phantom limb pain, and he, just by touching the stump, he could evoke touch sensations in the phantom hand. But then this really cool bit of work where if he touched the face, then he could map out accurately where the index finger was, where the middle finger, the thumb, etc. was on the face. So by touching a particular part of the face, you could accurately know that you were going to elicit a sensation of touch in the phantom finger. I mean, to me, that's just unbelievably cool stuff to hear. And then I just remember this one bit of work where he said, and I put a piece of ice against the cheek, and then as the ice water just rolled down the cheek, this person felt the ice water roll down the phantom. So, I mean, just mega cool work, isn't it? And at the same time as him reading this book and being influenced about what we think of as cortical mechanisms for these experiences, that he went to a lecture, and David Butler was speaking at this lecture and suggesting that the pain had something to do with pain. And I'm kind of embarrassed to even say this now, but we used to have this mantra: pain in the brain, issues in the tissues, and some of you will have heard that in the past. We've moved on from there, but you know, at this time, this is what we were thinking, and it was revolutionary stuff as well. It was like, let's take this path up the afferent pathway, let's journey up the afferent pathway, up to the glory above, it used to be called, up to the glory above, to the brain. So Lorimer was saying, right, okay, given what Ramachandran has found, you know, is there a way of us designing processes to help these athletes that had pain just when they were thinking about moving? And Ramachandran used mirror boxes as a way of sort of replacing this lost limb, sort of this idea of replacing movement, seen movement in the brain. So he used the mirror just as you see at the bottom of your screens here. So by putting the mirror in the midline, looking into the mirror, having the phantom hand hidden behind the box, and having the intact hand present, you could move around the intact hand, and it would appear as though the hand was moving in behind the box, not behind the box, but it would appear that there was a hand moving where there was no hand. And there's some interesting results with that. So it's worth going into the papers and just saying, actually, for a couple of people, it was dreadful. It really made them worse. They had really significant responses. My experience of using mirror therapy as a standalone approach has been quite similar as well. So it's can be quite provocative, it can be quite strong. The sense, and people often describe it as a sort of weird sense that they have, weirdness, and it can make some people feel quite sick. seeing themselves moving again. So mirror therapy was explored by Ramachandran in one person who had phantom limb pain. They took the mirror home with them, and they had incredible success in practicing moving and seeing their movement of the phantom. So that was one idea. People were exploring motor imagery and have explored motor imagery for years and years and years. So you know, an example would be in sport or in neurological conditions like stroke as well. People who have been using motor imagery. What hadn't been explored an awful lot was a sort of a subset of what motor imagery was thought to be, is a left-right judgment task. So at the top here, we've got a picture of a hand, and you know, if I was going to ask you to just shout out, is it a left or a right hand? There are thought to be processes that you go through in order for you to accurately identify whether you're seeing a left and a right hand. And pulling all of that together, Lorimer found evidence that what you have is cortical activation of the premotor cortex with the left-right judgment tasks without activating the primary motor cortex. So if someone was thinking about moving, if they're imagining moving, you activate your motor cortex, but you're not moving, so there must be some inhibition of the muscles. So that might be a way of taking yourself backwards, you know, taking a step back and saying, is there a kind of way to offer movement back to someone when just thinking about moving is painful? So this was the idea essentially behind graded motor imagery. Is, in a way, it was saying, okay, if moving is painful, can you give yourself movement in a different way and it's less painful or not painful? So mirror therapy might be one way. Okay, instead of that sort of visual feedback, which can be a really quite a strong, give someone a strong sense of movement, can we take that away? So motor imagery, or it's called explicit motor imagery, so you know that you're imagining moving, is a path that you could take. And then what about if just thinking about moving is painful? Can we go somewhere with that? And the left-right judgment tasks come from there. So motor imagery, graded motor imagery, essentially is the stepwise process of moving through left-right judgment tasks to imagining moving, to using a mirror to give you a visual feedback of moving a limb that's hidden behind the mirror. And the original research, there was some really funky bits to it. What Lorimer managed to do is he embedded a process of exposure in it. So he created exposure in terms of how much someone anticipated moving would create pain. He used time, number of images, as well as a way of starting off relatively safely and then creating exposure to that movement through each step in the process. One thing I've got to say, and I think if you can see my mouse just coming up here, it says if symptoms worsen, go down, if symptoms improve, go up. One thing it did is it said, okay, it gave someone somewhere to go when moving was a problem. And he's also included this idea, well, you know, if left-right judgment tasks are a problem, if we've got somewhere to go. So essentially what this is saying, I think, is there's an optimism there. You know, we have hope. There is something that we can do. No matter how disabled, no matter how painful things might be, we've got somewhere where we can go. But I have massive issues with this as well, because the suggestion here is, you know, let's take yourself away from your life and just practice doing left-right judgment tasks on a phone. I mean, that's just not life. And I don't know anybody who can do that. Equally, there are problems where science is set out in such a way where we're saying, okay, for Lorimer's RCTs, it was a 2-week process. So you do 2 weeks of this, then you move on and you spend 2 weeks doing that. And then you finish with another 2 weeks, and then you pop out the end and you're ready to go, so to speak. To me, that's not a real life situation. So time is a massive factor that I feel has been missed out in someone's interpretation of research, and how we offer a pragmatically graded motor imagery to someone. There are a few other issues, but if I start moaning, it sounds like I'm just a moaning Brit. But we'll come back to that. We'll come back to that in a little bit. But a sort of quick summary: graded motor imagery is someone practicing identifying images of left and right body parts. Originally, as it was set out, it was body parts of their affected region. Then they were taking themselves through a process of imagining moving the affected body part. And then they were actually moving the affected body part, but they were getting a different visual feedback of the movement that they were taking themselves through. On that note, so I'm not going to jump forwards too quickly, because I think that there are some mega cool things we can take from this. Now, the original research suggested that people with CRPS always had a slower response time to identifying the affected body part. And actually, what we find clinically is that's not always the case. So sometimes you don't find any change. Sometimes you actually find that they're extremely speedy identifying the affected body parts. And then if we start being a bit funkier with things, if you move around the body and you say, okay, what happens instead of just looking at the hands, what happens if you try and identify left and right feet? They might have shifts in the identification of alternate body parts. So it's almost like there has been a shift in priority. They prioritized the ability to identify left and right images of the affected body part at the expense of unaffected regions. So there's some really very cool stuff that we get from running experiments and exploring within a person the results that you get from these judgment tasks. There's more to it than that. Maybe we'll have a chance to talk about that later, but just jumping onto the motor imagery, the thing that really grabbed my attention when I was exploring graded motor imagery was the descriptions that people would have, these sort of body perceptual descriptions. And you'd often ask someone to do a fairly simple body scan, just run your mind through your arm, and I'd hear things like, I can't see it. It's like it's not there. So what we might term now disembodied metaphors. And it's just, I can picture sort of being in an old clinic actually, and this lady literally using that phrase. She just said it's like it's not there. It's really striking that the consequence or a part of a pain experience might be that body part no longer exists when you take yourself through this process. And that's, to me, that's just super fascinating, and to me it raises questions that are saying, well, in that case, would it be helpful for that person to have that ability, or not having that ability, does that continue to influence their ongoing pain state and disability? So there are a few questions that really jump out that I find absolutely fascinating from this. So graded motor imagery. A last little point is, science is science, isn't it? And what happened within the scientific frameworks is they were relatively homogenized samples. So where do we fit heterogeneity into the picture? And quite simply, CRPS has not got a big enough population. There are still plenty of theories about whether or not there are different subclasses or phenotypes of CRPS. What Lorimer did in his RCT, so if we just move on, can we do that? It's not helping, it's not liking that. So with his first two RCTs, the ones published in 2004 and 2005, they were just in this homogenous group of people who developed CRPS after a wrist fracture. But then he included two different groups, albeit very, very small numbers, of phantom limb pain and brachial plexus avulsion injury. So, I mean, essentially phantom limb pain patients. So there is a little bit of heterogeneity there, but not a massive amount. There's something, though, in this work that, okay, so there's small numbers, there's a bit of a risk of bias as well, because you can't blind, you know, the practitioner very well, and in terms of the treatment that they're delivering. These are all trials done by the same person. So, you know, there's risk of bias there, but something Lorimer had done is he'd taken what traditionally people think of as enigmatic pain conditions. So pain conditions that are traditionally quite tough to treat. And my first, I don't know why I'm laughing, it's quite sad actually, but my first sort of memories of ever seeing someone with complex regional pain syndrome, in fact, they come with a diagnosis of reflex sympathetic dystrophy. So this is sort of 20 years ago. And this lady came into my clinic. I was working in a hospital at the time, and there's almost nothing I could do for her. At that time, we were trying to do passive things like tape her limb. She was cycling through various different medications. I felt like, I mean, she felt like she got a lot out of our time together, probably just because I was so fascinated and just actually listened to her story. But, you know, ultimately, there was very, very little that I could offer this lady. So Lorimer here, he's come up with an approach that offers hope for traditionally incredibly tough conditions to treat. And his idea behind why it was working was, if cortical mechanisms underpin the disease, it would seem reasonable to target them in treatment, train the brain. It was massively influenced originally by Ron Melzack and the Neuromatrix model, and then work that came from that, things like Herta Floor's work on back pain and phantom limb pain, where they demonstrated a shift in the activation within primary somatosensory and primary motor cortices in these people in pain. So the idea was essentially around this sensory motor incongruence. That's a sensory motor incongruence theory, wasn't there? So, you know, they were getting, there was an expectation and reality mismatch between the information they were getting and what they were able to do about it. So their actions out into the world. There's been a bit of, I suppose, an update in what cortical reorganization might be. So just taking yourself through this picture here. This is Herta Floor's review from 2017. It's quite a nice review actually for you to explore. Here, the A is what the sort of typical reorganization might be: expansion and shift of cortical representations in different areas. Primarily the research was done in the primary somatosensory cortex. But then they've added on top of this, so this is sort of grown since GMI was proposed, alterations in grey matter volume in a number of different regions, altered resting state and pain-evoked functional connectivity, altered glial activity, impaired descending inhibitory control, and altered structural integrity and connectivity of white matter. So cortical reorganization, if it was looked at today, would be a lot more than, can we give someone back a sort of what they were referring to is normalize cortical reorganization. So give back, you know, essentially normalize this expansion or shift of the representation within the brain. I've just pulled out one comment here from Kuhner and Floor's article, which I think is a nice sort of way of interrogating those trials is that the biological variability inherent to snapshot-like single spatial and temporal representations may account for the discrepancies that are reported across studies. So, I mean, what they're saying is, you know what, our work wasn't wrong, but we were limited by the technology or the investigative technology that we had at that time. And what you see in pain is you see those little snapshots, don't you? You see a sort of a window, and how things have changed more recently. So groups like Karen Davis's group, Gian Domenico Iannetti's group, is they started to add a temporal dynamic to the picture. They started saying, you know what does brain activation, whatever that means, what does it look like over time? And there used to be this concept of noise, didn't there? You know, it's just noise, background noise. This resting state was considered noise. So when people started saying, well, is it noise or isn't it noise? They started realizing that actually there is fluctuation of cortical activation constantly. There's a buzzing that continues. So yeah, cortical reorganization, what is it? What really is it? If we were to design GMI now, is that the mechanism that would be proposed to account for why it may be beneficial or what you are trying to target in that population? So I would argue, and I hope you can see this picture here. So this is, I don't know what you call it. I call it a clinical interview. So when I go through a clinical interview, if I have someone who uses descriptions that suggest body perception disturbances, then I get them to draw themselves. So here we have the drawing of someone actually with CRPS of their foot. I'm fascinated here because if you look through her drawing, her arm, even her face, there are changes. Actually, what we know, a more up-to-date understanding of CRPS is that it's very, very common to have hemisensory deficits or hemisensory changes. So you often find, if you're exploring with your physical examination, if you find changes in the affected limb, you'll find changes throughout that side of the body. With this particular person, in fact, it was too much for us to do any kind of sensory investigation to begin with on her leg. She was so sensitive. So we started exploring things in her face, which, coming back to my original title about the foundations of creativity, for me, learning about GMI and the foundations of GMI, it afforded me that flexibility to say, it's okay. In fact, it's not just okay, it's probably prudent to evaluate away from the most painful area. So I think Kat might be in a better position to confirm that or not. What I've noticed in people who have extremely sensitive pain conditions, do not jump into that most painful area. Invite yourself in or ask permission better, before you go anywhere. And if they say, please don't go near my foot, my arm, my hand, whatever it might be, do not do it. Don't do it. Step away from that area. So here we have this. I would say, are we targeting the brain? I would say, and this is my bias, I'm more interested in the human. I'm interested in that person in front of me. I'm interested in them. I'm interested in their interaction in their world. And I've taken this little snippet from, we've talked about Mick Thacker just off air beforehand, but here's I think the best model ever to come out of a physiotherapy paper. So Louis Gifford's mature organism model is a circular model. It's a dynamic model that doesn't separate out tissues and brain and world. In fact, it considers pain as a conscious event, describing the dynamic interplay and interconnectedness between the person and their environment via the body as a whole. Therefore, damage, threat, and stress affect the whole person. And we could probably say it affects more than the whole person. So what my experience of someone who has CRPS is, it influences their whole life world, you know, their relationships, their ability to work, their role within the family as well. I mean, the shift can be, you know, utter. So I would say, are we really targeting the brain? Or if we were to be true to the original theory and the underlying model that was used to describe the theory, or to rationalize the theory, the neuromatrix model, it was brain-centric, it was neurocentric. Is that the best model for us to use, and do we have a better model or more up-to-date model? The honest truth is that's the best model we currently have with that has been interrogated. But I would suggest that there are better models for us to use, and it's early days still. I mean, it's surprising for me that the idea of embodied cognition, which is this model is an example of embodied cognition, has not been utilized more widely for our understanding of pain. So this human perspective of pain, amazingly, is not something that is used that often. So there we go. Are we targeting the brain? I would urge we're targeting the person. So here is a lady, Mary, who I think I learned masses amount from. I mean, learn an awful lot from all my patients, but particularly Mary, she's really taught me a huge amount. And I love this quote here: like a pile up on the motorway, there's no point trying to force your way through. You have to find an alternate route round. And I'm just putting this up here. First of all, the picture of Mary in the wheelchair. What I've found is a number of people come to me and they're incredibly disabled, but they're trying to maintain as much mobility, let's say, much of their ability to do things as they possibly can. But there's an expense that they're paying. There's a cost to it. So one of the things that Mary had to do is accept that utilizing the wheelchair was an important step for her. And a lot of the time there's a stigma revolving around this use of aids, I find anyway, and particularly a stigma revolving around the use of a wheelchair for someone who could walk, but by just standing and walking even a couple of steps, that might put her in bed for the rest of the day and make her ill. So you know, these are options. There's a few other things to say about this. So Mary, this is like part of her treatment, actually. She's taken herself out into the world that's meaningful for her. So for her, it's out into nature. This is the north of England. She is, I would say, she's finding ways of nourishing herself, but accepting she has to make some adaptations at the time to be able to do that. So giving herself something back, but putting herself in the best possible place to succeed as she's doing that. And she's done a couple of things. So you can see she's crossed her foot over into her safe space. So if we get a chance when we have a little chat, we can talk about space-based processing, but there's a deliberate nature of her putting her affected foot onto her safe space, into her less affected or non-affected side. And I just want to put, I mean, for those of you, if you've not seen CRPS, so these are her pictures of her foot. So her affected foot, not in the worst phase, I have to say as well, but at a time when she was all right, when I said, do you mind if we take a photo of your foot for our records? And then this is a thermography scan. So this is looking at temperature of her limbs. And if you like me, again, this is just incredible, isn't it? That her foot is essentially the same temperature as the surrounding air. So are we just treating the brain? I mean, vasomotor changes, obviously you have sort of top-down influences on the limb. I would say we're thinking about the whole person, aren't we? But there is a danger when someone hears that we're treating the brain or we're targeting the brain, that we forget that there are these obvious changes of the limb. And again, just coming back to diagnostic criteria for CRPS, the diagnostic criteria for the vasomotor changes, if there is a 1 degree or more difference between the affected limbs. Now, given that her unaffected side, I mean, what's that? It's going to be, let's say it's in the early 30s, maybe in the late 20s. There is sort of 4, 5, 6 degrees, let's say, difference between the two sides. And it's not uncommon for me to see at least that difference in temperature between affected limbs in someone with CRPS. And you hear people say, you know, it doesn't feel like mine. It's like you know, it's just rigid. It's like, what have I said? It's like a brick. One of the most fascinating descriptions I ever heard of was my legs like a pillow full of lead feathers. So, wrap your head around what that must mean to them. But I'm guessing the idea of it being lead means that it's probably, you know, cold there. So I want to take you, through to Mary, because she sort of embodies a process I think of as encompassing creativity. So to me, what GMI offered me was, okay, so there's hope for people in respect of movement, but let's not just limit it to movement. So if we're thinking exposure is a process for us to explore, and context sensitivity essentially is the sort of harder science phrase to describe what we're doing, is we're looking for different context that we are sensitive to. And that might mean that for her, the sensory stimulus on her feet in one environment will be felt, experienced as different to another environment. So for her, going to a hydrotherapy pool, absolutely no. Going to the beach and having her feet in the sand in the beach and having the waves lapping up on her feet was much more achievable. So here's an example of one of the, I think, the priceless ideas that came out of GMI for me is understanding the influence of context and how we might embed that into someone's rehabilitation. We've got another example just at the top. So Mary's original injury was a sprained ankle in a hockey game. So here we have her. She's painted her nails. I hope you can see that. That's really deliberate to try and give a sense that every time she's looking at her feet, that they look quite similar, even though there might be discoloration there. So there's a sort of deliberate, what can I give back? And this is very much taken on the idea that mirror therapy is the idea of giving back a sense that the limb that you're seeing is more like the limb that you feel should be there. So that there's a sort of expectation and reality matching. You're trying to bring them closer together. Or if you're interested in predictive processing, you're reducing the error, the prediction error. You're trying to bring it a little bit closer. And then again, so she's got this, a part of therapy, literally, I want to see my feet whilst I'm in this context-sensitive environment of being at a hockey game. So hockey game, maybe this is more provocative, or she's exposing herself to something that may have been provocative. And she's also got sort of this rounded idea of rehabilitation, of giving back a healthy sense of self. I would suggest that might be. What have I said here? Sense of self and a salient environment. Yeah, the idea of saliency, this is very brain-centric here, but this is a picture taken from Aaron Cucci and Karen Davis's paper. Very cool paper. Have a look through it. Probably need to read it 4 or 5 times to grab everything you possibly can from it. But the idea of saliency for me, I think, fits a population of people with CRPS very, very well. And you know, why or how that's developed, I'm not entirely sure. Is it because there are sampling changes in the periphery? So literally the shift in transduction at the nociceptive neuron in the periphery. Is it a shift in sampling in the central nervous system at a number of different levels? Is it because of changes in, as they've suggested, in places like the insula, which is thought to be active, particularly when something occurs that you don't expect to happen? So what you do here, though, is that people can be jumpy, and things, you know, things that they didn't expect to be painful are painful. You know, like Jane is saying here, I have pain just from the puff of a wind. Well, under normal circumstances, the wind just blowing over you shouldn't be provocative, should it? It shouldn't be painful. But now suddenly it is. And the more it happens, the more salient it is, the more likely you're going to look out for it. So we know that saliency has some influence on attention and attentional processes. So coming back, I probably haven't said a massive amount about GMI, have I? But the original mapping out of what GMI as a process is, I've said the left-right judgment tasks appear to give us some indication of the priority that you give of images and images to body parts. And the part of that priority might be your attention. And that is either your attention towards or away from the body part. So I think an appreciation of whatever saliency is, however it comes about, but that there might be a rehabilitation process, broadly graded exposure, that allows you to give someone back meaningful activities in such a way that you reduce the level of saliency they have to that activity. In other words, you're able to do something. For Jane, what she was aiming to do was to travel. In order for her to travel, she had to get comfortable being wheeled in a wheelchair, going in a car, eventually going in a boat, and then an aeroplane. So I was going to call this slide "Dog Basket and Electric Toothbrush," because in order for her to move towards her goal of being able to travel and see her family. So she lives on an island and she wanted to travel off the island to go and see her family. She hadn't traveled off the island for 13 years because of CRPS and because of a disability. So she had started a process of getting comfortable, happy with the likely sensory stimuli she was going to come across as she did that travel. So for her, what she had to do was start getting comfortable with vibration. So just the vibration of an electric toothbrush under a fairly substantial dog basket, you know, she could only tolerate for a short period of time. So Lorimer's original ideas about grading exposure to movement, here we've got a beautiful idea of grading exposure to vibration, but as a means for her to get to where she wants to go. So again, I could take you through multiple different things that Jane was working on in order for her to be able to achieve that goal of getting off the island and going to see her family. if we go back to the sort of mechanistic approach, is it because there's a habituation to that process? Are they just, you know, in other words, you're doing it so much, in a way, your nervous system or your neuroimmune system or your brain mechanisms, the brain response, the saliency network is just going, I don't care about this anymore. Yeah, fine, no worries. I'm happy with that. I know what's going to happen. So that might be one process, or it might be about attention and attentional gain or suppression as well. So I think these would be super interesting ideas for us to explore and figure out as we go along. Saliency, God, and whoa, we could jump into the default mode network and what they are calling the anti-nociceptive system as well, but for now we just stick with saliency. And here I've got I think one of the coolest sculptures. This is in a park in Norway. So I just think it sort of encapsulates what you often hear from someone who's in pain. You hear that pain might have agency over them. It's like their life shrinks, their life possibilities become smaller. What's available to them, what's possible to them shrinks. So, you know, there's this battle of trying to branch out and do more, but they're constantly restricted. So there's a great Ian Edwards paper. Again, if you haven't read it, read it many times. There's lots in there, but a part of the study that they're just find that descriptions of pain reflected an intersubjectively affected self. And just taking some ideas from the philosophy world, because I think it's time that we did that in PT, didn't we? If you disrupt the relationship between sensory input and motor output, and this profoundly disturbs a perceiver's ability to experience the world. So someone's ability to experience the world. I mean, what is GMI doing? It's one way, one approach, and at the heart of it, there are foundational principles that allow someone to integrate this sensory input, to act in the world, and to bring them closer to being able to experience the world as they feel they should or they want to. And I suppose at the heart of GMI is giving someone hope and optimism that will happen, or that can happen. So I just thought, what have I taken from GMI? I've been meaning to write a paper on this, and I've got I've got drafts written from 5, 6, 7 years ago, and I still haven't finished it. So I wonder what I was thinking then and what I'm thinking now. So here you go. What am I thinking now? First of all, it's a journey, and you take this journey together. I suppose if you want to use long words, then it's intersubjectivity. So yeah, I feel one of the biggest parts of my clinical encounter is whether someone wants to take that journey with you, or you want to take that journey with them as well as a clinician. I've set my clinic up in such a way that I don't see people often. I'm there and I can support them. I support them from afar. But we recognize that the journey might be a long journey as well. They've often come to me when they've seen multiple, I'm sure this is similar for everybody, but many, many other clinicians. And often they come with me when essentially they've lost hope. You learn, and if you've got young kids, this will be really familiar for you, but you learn through exploration. Trial and error, for me, are learning opportunities. And my example of Jane being in a darkened room is that, you know, things have become so desperate that there was no sense of a meaningful life when I met her. But what we see in pain, and particularly what we see in CRPS, is it's almost as though people are trying and they keep doing, but they fail in inverted commas, because they're not failing, but things have become so sensitized and so disabling, it's as if you fail every time you try and do something. GMI to me means you have somewhere to go. It might mean you'd have to take a few steps backwards, you can take a few steps to the side. In other words, you can incorporate exposure principles, or you can reflect and understand the notion of context sensitivity, so that when you explore things in life, in your world, in your day, that when things don't go exactly as you expect, you can take that on board and you can say, I'm going to learn from that. You know, what can I do that might be slightly differently, that means that the next time I do it, I can achieve some success. And I think people sort of see this as, I don't know, anathema to rehabilitation. But what I've learned from my clients, my patients, is, you know what, use everything you've got available, anything you've got available to open up these possibilities. That's your family, your friends, your work, adaptive tools, anything you can do. If you want to do something, it's not cheating by using something to help you do it. So use whatever you have available to open up some possibilities, some opportunities. And probably one of the biggest phrases that I use is a window of opportunity. Let's see if we can open a window of opportunity. So the next time you try this, there's a chance that you'll be able to do it, succeed, it will feel okay. Find ways to create meaningful activities in your day. And meaningful activities in your day, I'm just taking examples from the two people that I've presented, might mean that you have breakfast with your husband. It might mean that literally you can sit at a breakfast table and you can have a conversation. You start taking meaning and success from what ordinarily people just see as, they take for granted, don't they? So find ways, and for the more disabled people, it might mean that these have to be little snippets as well. Little snippets. Find ways to experience success, then reward yourself. The more I treat people, particularly if this journey is a long journey, you've got to find a way of rewarding yourself. Otherwise, it's demoralizing. The process of change can be so long. So find a way of rewarding yourself. And maybe it's that you can reflect and say, I had breakfast with my husband today. Great. It might be that you've taken yourself out for a meal for the first time in 2 years, 3 years. So find ways of rewarding yourself. And I mean, hypothetically, we could rationalize different biological mechanisms into that, wouldn't we? So the reward processes. And change can be slow, but it will happen. So you are not the same person day on day, week on week, month on month. The beauty of graded motor imagery for me isn't, let's deliver this over a 6-week period. It's saying, if we create flexibility for this person, we can offer them change long into the future. So Jane, from going from a darkened room in bed with her affected side sort of safely close to the wall, was able, but over a very long period, for some people would consider this over 7 years, she was able to open up the possibility of traveling by plane and going to her sister's wedding. I would say massive change, but it didn't happen overnight. So change can happen, but it's going to be a slow one. And then the last one I've got here is, you are only limited by your combined creativity. I love treating children because there's no limit to what's possible with them. They don't have this, you should walk down the stairs in this exact way every time, or when I pick something up from the floor, this is how I should do it. They have 1,000 ways of walking downstairs or coming downstairs or sitting on a seat. And I use that idea with my patients is, let's come up with a number of different creative ways of doing this. I have little homework opportunities that I offer people. Can we come up with 10 different ways of doing that? Can you find 10 different ways of sitting on your chair? So you want to sit at breakfast, have dinner, have breakfast with your husband. Let's find different ways of you being able to sit on your chair so that it's not the same rigid pattern. So for me, GMI offered me that. It said, I can bring my creativity in. In fact, what we know is it's important to bring creativity, flexibility, variability back to people. And I think GMI really allowed me to do that. So I'll probably stop there. And what I'll do is I'll stop sharing and just say, people, thanks to you guys for listening in, and anybody else who's going to listen in the future. I have to say thanks to everyone at NOI, particularly Dave Butler. Lorimer actually isn't part of NOI, but particularly Dave Butler. I mean, I just went on such an amazing journey, and it's been over the last sort of 12, 13, 14 years I've been teaching with them. So yeah, this particular time of learning to teach online has been my next massive learning curve as well. And GMI is something that I incorporate into my thinking, but it's something I flexibly use. So yeah, and I think that comes, to a degree from Lorimer. He's a scientist, but as a clinician, he's an incredibly empathic person as well. So yeah, thanks to Loz as well for really influencing that. And then probably the most important people, Jane and Mary, I mean, they've been two hugely influential people on my career and understanding GMI. They're certainly not the only people, but I learned so much from the people that I interact with as well. So the idea of a journey, I think, is probably the most important thing for me now. If they feel confident in you, comfortable with you, you build a relationship. I know their families, I know what they're doing. I've now, with Mary, I went to her wedding, and now she's had children since. There's, for me, these are the beauties of what you do, aren't they, as a clinician? So yeah, I totally changed my way of practicing because of Lorimer and GMI, and trying to find a way of incorporating that into my practice. So I see very few people, and I see them over what a lot of people would say is a very long time. Not in one go always, but stretched over time.